So today we're going to look at how to photograph flowers, and this is purely how I photograph flowers, and you'll end up with the sort of photographs that I will use in the demonstration here. Other people have different ways of flower photography, and they would obviously use different techniques. A lot of them will be similar because these are similar techniques when you are identifying a subject to actually photograph. So the first critical thing about photographing flowers and plants is to love them. And I went to a presentation by a photographer who was a wonderful landscape photographer, and he said his secret was that he absolutely loved beaches. And he had been admiring them all his life, and he knew what to look for and what time of day to get there and what made them look beautiful. And he said that what he's learned out of that is if you want to be a good photographer, photograph things that you love, because you see things in them that other people don't, and you can get the best out of them. If you love flowers, then you'll end up being a good photographer of flowers. And that's with if you love dogs, then photograph dogs. If you love buildings, photograph buildings. And you'll become a really good photographer in that genre because you will see things other people want. Admiring plants means that you know which plants will photograph well, and we'll talk about the sort of things that I look for. You'll also know exactly when they're in flower. So this dogwood that I've got a photograph here, I know this dogwood is in flower the third week in September, and I know to look out for it and be ready to shoot it. I know it's best shot first thing in the morning because that's when the light falls on it, when it's at an angle, and I can really pick up the textures, and the morning light allows it to glow. So I know that, I look out for it, and I shoot it then. If you love flowers, you've really looked at them and you know which is their best profile. Just like with people, they've always got a best profile. So once you've decided to photograph plants, you need to choose that candidate flower that you're going to photograph. And you need to make sure that it's structurally interesting. I try and pick flowers that are architecturally interesting. They've got different shapes, different textures, different lines. Stamens are distinct in colour from the petals, that they're just not blur. And you know, it's great if the petals are different colours or they're striated, or they're like roses, often toned from the middle to the tips. They just make it a lot more interesting visually. Aesthetically pleasing, ones that people think, oh, that's a beautiful flower. Tonally and colour variable, and that allows your photograph to have a lot more depth in it. And the first thing I do is try and isolate a flower. And if you've been out with me when I've been photographing flowers, you'll see I always walk right around the plant, trying to visually isolate a flower. And so this is where the sun's coming from. We've got two things here. We're trying to isolate the flower and then get a good background. So I'm walking around, I'm currently walking straight up to it, and the sun is in front of me but to the left. And now I've walked around right, and the sun is coming from sort of from that direction through the back of these flowers, and so they're sort of being a bit backlit. But I can see that there's one rose here that's isolated from background clutter, and it's sticking out from everything else, because the moment I try and shoot, this one's probably okay, but it's not going to be visually very pleasant. This one's is isolated, but it's not far enough off a background, where I'm trying to get it off a background and isolate it from clutter. And so I then just shot it, and that's what it looks like. And because it's way off that background, it would be at least 10 feet away from those bushes in the background. It allows that background to blur. The background is also much darker tonally, so that allows me to shoot that photo, that rose. Like, I will often walk around this bush and I can't find one that I can shoot. I don't bother shooting if I can't do those two things. Isolate it, have it that it's compositionally interesting, and that I can get the light so that it's tonally different to its background, and also get the background a long way away from it. And the other thing is that you've got to watch with the light, and it's almost happened there and with that rose, is that early morning sun, as you can see from the sky, was not cloudy, and so the sun was very contrasty and bright. So it's left me with a really high dynamic range, and luckily it was just within a range it could capture without blowing out those petals to being white. I tend to shoot in situ. 90% of my flowers have been shot in situ, and usually without a flash. I only use the flash if the flower is moving a lot, and it means I've got to have such a high shutter speed that, because when it's windy, you've got to have a really high shutter speed, and that will mean I have to put my ISO up so high that photo will end up grainy. But I prefer not to use flash. If I do, it's very low, and I put diffusers on it, and I keep it off camera, and I try and make it like sunlight rather than, I don't like things that look flashed. Find good prospects. I love it after there's been that really light misty rain in the morning. You get those beautiful little dewdrops, and you can't get that with a spray bottle, and you can't get it with a hose. It really needs that incredibly micro mist that you get to get dewdrops to look like that. If I am going to pick flowers, I pick them and shoot them. I try and get them, I literally have everything set up, go and pick them, put them in a vase, and then shoot them. And someone said to me once, only shoot live flowers. They have a life force. It's like shooting dead people. If you shoot, not that I have done much of this, their eyes aren't alive. It's like fish. You tell the freshness of fish by how glassy their eyes are. And the same, that life force goes from flowers, and it's really odd that could be, but the best flower photographs I've ever taken are when the flowers are really freshly picked, or alternatively in situ. So I know it's hard if you have to get your flowers from a florist to get really fresh ones, but ideally just go and shoot them in situ, and you'll see all of the, apart from the ones in vases, nearly everything has been shot in situ. Once you've chosen the fresh, perfect flower and you've isolated it, what you've got to then do is try and get one that's not flawed. And often you're so busy getting the background right and the architectural shape right and the composition right, you don't notice the flaws. And you think, oh, I can fix it in post. Well, only bother shooting it if you can fix it in post, and you know you can. Now this rose, I was in such a hurry because I shot this as part of shooting for this workshop, and I only had like 20 minutes to do all the shots. And I was so busy making sure that I'd got the background right, that I got it in focus, that I'd had the composition right. I didn't look at it. And I got it back, and it's got all those insect bites. So only shoot it if you think you can fix it in post. This was another rose bush in my backyard, and in this early morning sun, it's very contrasty and bright. Because remember, when we saw the sky, it was very blue and there's no clouds, and that causes quite sharp shadows and big tonal difference in terms of dynamic range. So in that case, I want to shoot a flower that's being softly lit in the shadow, but I didn't want it positioned against that bright green grass, because as we've spoken about before, anything that's got yellow in it will completely overwhelm this flower. So what I had to do was try and use that shadow as the background, and that meant getting down low and then positioning myself so the entire composition had the background as shadow, and that's what allows you to get these beautiful, really black backgrounds, which makes them look like they've been shot in a studio. So it's just a matter of walking around and trying to get the tones right in the background as well as the colors right. So again, this is what it looked like in situ when I walked up to it. There's a lot of dynamic range in here because the sun is so bright. and I don't want to shoot it with that bright yellow background. So you can see the shadow on the right there. It means moving around till I can get it in shadow, exposing for the flower, because the flower is so much brighter than the background. If you don't manually expose this, it will expose for the background and just blow the flower out completely. So you've got to manually expose for the flower to ensure that you don't blow its highlights. And then that turns the background completely black. And again, makes it look like a studio shot in that the background is silhouetted, or the flower is silhouetted against the background. So when I say about shifting the point of view to optimize the tonal contrast, that works in reverse as well. I often shoot, if I can get down low and shoot up, that allows me in a very cloudy sky to get a pure white background. And a pure white often works really well as well. And the dogwood up there, because it's a dogwood tree, I have to shoot up because all the flowers at the top, it's the only place it gets the sun. So I have to expose for the flower, manually change my exposures to make sure the flower is exposed correctly, and then just blow out the light. The other thing is to optimize the colors in the background. Often my flowers are amongst other flowers, and I use the background to provide that painterly look for it. And in this case, this rose, this English heritage rose, was sticking up, and the only background you can see is really ordinary. But if you choose your depth of field, you can blur that background. It's so far away, it would be at least 30, 40 feet away, at least 30 feet. So I know if I choose a depth of field just for the flower, I can use the colors in the background to actually enhance the photo. And so if I had not had a really wide aperture, I would have got that trellis and the garage door in the background. Whereas because I have used a really wide aperture, I think it was f4 on this, that I've now just made the flower in focus and blurred everything else out. And you can see it. It makes a lot more interesting photo having the colors in the background. And the same with this iris. Again, I had the shed doors in the background. The best position I could find was to try and get it away from all these yellow leaves, which were very close and not far enough away. And I could then just use the shed doors for the background. So the background can be anything. In the case of this magnolia, this was the orange in the background is actually a high-vis plastic fence used as a barricade, but it was a long way away, like 50 meters away. And I knew that if I exposed for the flower and used a depth of field that just dealt with it, it then would give me that lovely green-orange background. And so look at the backgrounds. If they're far enough away, use the colors. And so in this one on the right, this was in at Melbourne University. It was one of the university buildings in the background, but it was a long way away, and it gave that beautiful bluey grey background. And the one up the top, the house was white, but the plant in the background, the rest of the magnolia, provides a bit of context colour and just gives me that tonal and colour contrast against it. So it really requires you to have your camera goggles on and try and visualise what the camera will see, and then try it. Once you've looked at the background, you've chosen your nice fresh flower, you've worked out what composition it will be, you've got the background, you've got the tonal contrast, you've worked out how you're going to take it, then move around, try some different options and try different points of view, because you don't always want just a flower sitting in the middle of an image. You want it to have a little bit of interest compositionally as well. And you can see in this one on the right, the colours in the background are just other flowers of the same colour, and it just gives it a little bit of context. So this is the water lily farm. and they have the most magnificent lotus flowers up there. And you can take them from all different points of view and get different compositions. So don't just always take them the same, just try different positions. And this is when I said before about loving flowers. If you love flowers, you know that what positions that they looked good in. One of the issues I have when a lot of people show me their flower photographs, they've taken them with a wide angle lens rather than a long lens. And they've got up close with a wide angle lens. And what they end up with is everything else in the background is in focus. And then they crop it and they say, what do you think of my image? And I go, did you crop this? And I had someone a few weeks ago say to me, how do you know when we crop stuff? And you can just tell. And so you can see in this one, it just looks wrong. It's not like a portrait. It looks cropped. So this used a 24mm lens, f8, up close, trying to get the depth of field right, and it looked very ordinary. You can't just use a large lens, a wide lens, and get up close and hope it will work. It just doesn't. So by using a long lens, ideally greater than 100, above 70 will start to work. I use anything up to 400. So I prefer a long lens because what a long lens gives me is a narrow depth of field and blurs the background very quickly. So you can then start to isolate from the background when it is very close to the background. And you can see here, that background is close, but by using a 100mm lens and f8 has enabled me to get this sharp all the way through the flower, but has blurred the background. I typically start at f4, but often with quite a large flower like an iris, it doesn't give me enough depth of field. So this one here is when I moved it to 400. When you move it to 400, it means then you stand way back. And the f8 now has a shallower depth of field, and you can see these stamens here are no longer in focus. But it has allowed me to blur the background, and you could just leave it like this, or you can turn the background completely black. And the reason why you can do that is because within our editing software, it looks at what pixels are in focus and what aren't in focus when you say select subject or select background, and will very clearly distinguish the flower. If you have the flower like in this one, that's not that easy to distinguish from the background because of the background still in focus, it's very hard to just select the flower. The other thing that I do is look for shafts of light. I really love it when you get something that's spotlit, and this is very hard to do in the studio, to spotlit something and not have the background lit at the same time, to really isolate the lighting. And you can see here on this camellia bush, this is just some new leaves coming out. It's just a shaft of light coming through the dappled light of the hydrangea next to it, and it's just spotlit it. So if you expose for the leaves, it throws everything else out into darkness, and just gives you something that's really interesting to look at. So I'm always looking for these spotlit shafts of light. And so next week when we're in the gardens, if there's bushes around, you will get these shafts of light and get some really interesting compositions. So looking for shafts of light and how it spotlights flowers, then expose for the flower. And that allows you to get these sorts of images. I tend to like to photograph flowers early in the morning or late in the afternoon, typically early in the morning because they're fresher and they've got the moisture from the night before and there's often dew on them. The early morning light is lovely and soft. When I was doing this workshop shoot, it was about 10 o'clock in the morning, so it wasn't, I usually like to shoot earlier than that. That's what's made this quite contrasty. But I do like the backlighting that low light gives. If you can put the flower in front of it, but sort of on the side, so it's coming in through the petals on the side, that allows you then not to get lens flare by having the sun coming through the front of the lens, and it really highlights the details in the flower. This was taken late afternoon, very late afternoon. It was about 5:30 the night before, and the sun was low, and it was very, very cloudy. So it was a very, very soft light, a yellow light, and it gives a completely different look to the same flower shot the next morning with the light coming in the different direction. And so this is about, for your own garden, walk around it at those times of days and realize where the light's coming from and when is the best time to shoot this flower. I have a mental map of my entire garden of what month it needs to be shot, what time of day it needs to be shot, so that way I've already worked that out and I can just go out there and shoot it and come back. Try different aspect ratios when you're working out the composition. Try landscape, try what would it look as a square crop, and then move your camera around and take a vertical shot. Do that with almost everything. If you really love a subject or a scene, always try different aspect ratios. You can't lose anything. If you don't like it, throw it away. But there's nothing more frustrating than getting back and having it in front of you and think, this might have actually been better if I'd taken it as a portrait shot. You've at least got that option. So the technical requirements, well, I know a lot of you haven't got long lenses, but in order to shoot flowers like this, these are my sorts of shots. People should photograph flowers differently. To take flowers like this, you need a long lens, ideally between 70 and 400 millimeter lens. Because I really optimize the light in shooting the flower to make sure that it is exposed correctly, I have to use manual exposures. And you just can't use automatic because your camera will expose for the background. Most of these shots, most of the background is black. And so your flower will be completely blown out. So you have to use manual exposures. I always start at ISO 100, but I'm always having to deal with wind and flowers moving. So I've got to have a reasonably fast shutter speed because of the lens length. If I'm using a 200 millimeter lens, I need a shutter speed of a minimum of a 200th. Well, that usually caters mostly for wind. But if I'm going down to 100 or 70 for my lens length, I need to up my shutter speed to ensure that I cater for the flower moving in the wind. And that means sometimes I have to go above 100 for my ISO, but the ISO is the last thing to move. And now with our new sensors in our cameras, it's not such a big deal going up to even ISO 1000. The aperture I usually start at f4. Most of these have been shot at f4, but if I'm really up close with my 100mm lens and I have an architectural flower like an iris, I might get up to f18, f22 if it's going to occupy the entire frame. That gives me the depth of field. Being up that close with a long lens, I need to have a depth of field that's more than 1 millimeter. So it requires me to go right up. Be aware that the more that you go up from the sweet spot, most lenses have sweet spots around perhaps f6 through to about f11, where they're really, really sharp. When you go really wide and really narrow, it's outside the sweet spot and your lens isn't quite as sharp. I often see people shooting flowers with tripods, and when they're outside, the wind is moving so much and they've got a long lens, the tripod's going to actually offer nothing, because the only way tripods work when something's moving is if you're panning, and you're panning in a particular plane. With flowers, you've got such a fast shutter speed anyway, a tripod is not very useful. As I said before, I rarely use flash. Sometimes I do if the flower is in a really dark spot and it's really poorly lit and I really want the photograph of this flower. But I always have an infuser on the flash and a trigger on my camera. I have the flash on a stand or a separate holder so that I can get the lighting right on the flower. Using a flash on your camera just makes it really glary and front lit, and it's not good lighting. So off-camera flash, if I use flash. And I always crop in camera. Frustrates me sometimes because I should have got perhaps a bit more in the image than I did. But that way you get all the information on those sensors, and you can blow these photos up to be A0 huge because they're sharp, because I haven't cropped them. I've used the entire sensor on them. And the other thing is, by cropping in camera, you get your composition right. There's no point in going, I'll work out the composition later. The flower just won't look right. It's like shooting people and saying, I'm going to use a really wide angle lens and just snap. And then I'll get something with a good pose later. No, it doesn't work that way. You've really got to try and get it in camera. Once you've shot it, review your composition, make sure you've got enough around the flower, that it looks right, that your depth of field is correct, and that your aperture is appropriate. If you wanted it to be sharp all the way through, well, you'll need to then narrow down your aperture. If you want the background blurry, then you may need to widen it. With all of our images, I've talked to you about in composition, working out the visual path that the viewer will actually view your image. And they normally start with people at the eyes. If the eyes aren't sharp, they lose interest. With flowers, if the center of the flower or the stamens aren't sharp, they lose interest. So if anything's going to be sharp in that flower photograph, it's the stamens. Sometimes flowers haven't got stamens, like really tightly budded roses, but they'll be looking in the center. So that's where your focal point needs to be. So you'll need to move it around to be there. If you're shooting the whole flower, then remember your rule of thirds and leading lines and things like that. Manually move the focal point. So learn where that is on your camera, of how you can move that focal point around, because you're using such narrow depths of field that you have to have those stamens in focus. Good luck. And I'm looking forward to seeing your work next week, and enjoy flower photography.